You know, most see religion as a body of beliefs. And today I want to share a way of seeing religion differently, as a keyhole into human consciousness and who we see ourselves to be. You know, I've, in an earlier podcast, redefined, or actually I went to the origin of the word religion, which is religare, which means to relink, to reconnect. There's this piece that connects us to what went before. I've talked about spirituality being the moment of now, and religion connecting this now to the previous now, so that we grow, so that there's continuity. Religion. I want us to see religion as threads of meaning, keyholes into the soul of human beings, keyholes into human consciousness itself within all these different cultures, and somehow get over this understanding of religion being about competing beliefs. Religion is really these places. What is it meant? Thomas Merton said, who we believe God to be says more about the believer than it does about God. And I think it's the same about religion. You see, it's when we look at these religions, we're seeing whole understandings, whole constellations of meanings that the human family has drawn on, and allowed it to create civilizations and to just be amazing in our understanding. And even, I might say, gave birth to some amazing fruit. Science of one of those, which creates a whole other thread of meaning. So I want us today to see religion not as competing belief systems, but again as threads of meaning that when pulled on lead us into the heart of who we think we are. And as I said, science, I believe, is doing the same thing. It's just using a different methodology. Science is really religion 2.0 or maybe 6.8, I don't know. But the point of what religion is about, the relinking, and what science is about relinking our lives to what is true and real, so we might find greater accord with this movement that is being, that is life, that is consciousness. It's the universe, the oneness of all creation. This is what we've talked about every spiritual journey is about, is learning to move more graciously in accord with finer nuances. And every religion is a little piece that we can bring to our awareness. Now, what we discern about who we are, how do we do that? There's so many ways. What we see when religion is seen as a keyhole to the human soul, well, here's kind of the way I see it. Now, I divided it up into two worlds, the East and the West. In the West, it's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam predominantly. In the East, it's Vedantism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism predominantly. And there's all kinds of in-between places. In the East, the focus was on freedom within, and in the West, it was on freedom without. At least it seems that way to me. And I've shared before in a podcast about the afterlife. In the West, it's heaven and hell, but there's a justice piece there, right? And in the East, it's reincarnation, but there's a justice piece. You see, something in the human soul, when we look through that little keyhole of those belief systems, those systems of meaning, the meanings we get are justice, no matter what the beliefs. And they're very different belief systems, but they each have the same outcome of meaning, which is justice. So today, I want us to see the Eastern tradition are these threads that weave together, and in the West, there are these traditions that weave together. And today what's happening is both of those little ropes of meaning are now being woven into a single rope. We're seeing, what did they say in the Vedas? Love is like incense and should flow through the whole house. We're seeing that religion, in its best expression, is about becoming a bastion for the positive emotions of love, compassion, joy, empathy, forgiveness, and hope. religion. Reconnecting in its best sense reveals and invites us into these positive aspects of the human soul, this quality of being. And so today, we're going to talk about the threads of meaning, looking at religion not as a belief system, but as a thread of meaning, just like all those beliefs that are different when the East and West of reincarnation and heaven, hell, but still come to a single meaning that tells us something about who we are. So, I just laid out a whole lot, and I'm going to just throw it to my cohorts, Bob and Marianne. Bob, I'll throw it to you first. Say what?
Okay. Well, I'm very ambivalent as I come to the latter portion of my life about religion. I have a lot of very strong positive feelings about religion, but most of those occurred when I was a child. I can still remember the little songs we learned in Sunday school. I can still remember the stories that my Sunday school teacher would tell us that she took from the Bible. And those things seemed so important to me then. And I look back on them and I think that the importance of those stories is really what you're getting at when you talk about meaning. And before we started, I asked you if you were going to distinguish between beliefs and meaning. And I'll take a quick stab at that. I think that the beliefs are those accoutrements of the religion that keep the people in power. They're the things that beliefs like you can only get to God through a priest, or you can only get to heaven through accepting Jesus. When in reality, the meaning behind all of these religions is love, is the golden rule, is justice, as you were putting it, is compassion. And it was when I began to realize that most of the people I was dealing with in the religion were not looking at those meanings. They were looking at all the accoutrements and all of the things that they could latch onto and say, well, I'm a better believer than you are. And if you don't believe it my way, then we're going to have to ostracize you, which went completely against all of the meaning that I thought was within the stories. There's nothing in the Beatitudes, for example, that says anything about shunning someone. It's all about accepting them and accepting the least of them and helping the least of them.
And Bob, you're putting your finger on how religion and belief systems become locked in a competing system instead of seeing them through these keyholes that I'm trying to get us to see, so we don't get caught up in that belief stuff.
Exactly, and I think that's very important.
Yeah. How about you, Marianne? Threads of meaning here.
Well, it's interesting. Threads of meaning in relation to religion. I had the opposite experience than Bob growing up with religion. I took away a lot of very negative things, and there was a lot of rules and regulations and guilt. And I know that, it's funny because I was just speaking with someone earlier today about the religion of our youth and how I honestly do not remember ever being taught Bible stories. I remember being taught dogma, and I remember being taught catechism, and I remember being taught rules and the things that you do to be a good person. And that was the only way that you were going to be saved, because you were fundamentally flawed. And so when you talk about religion as this keyhole, for me, the religion carries a lot of baggage. And so, but when you go beyond that to the idea of the meaning behind it, and I think that every single religion that you mentioned all have what Bob said was that fundamental piece of love behind it. And that it was the way that we interact with each other, the way we treat each other, and then people come in with what you you termed as beliefs, and layered those all over top of that. And then we created our own little factions. So in order to get to that, to get to the meaning, then you have to wash that away.
And what you're talking about, Mary Ann, and most atheists I know are like this. Religion has all these little eddies, okay? Mm-hmm. You got caught in an eddy, and you were wounded by it.
I didn't get caught in it. I was indoctrinated into it.
That's what I mean. You're the zeitgeist of your life, the spirit of the movement, what you were born into, the time, the culture, the the denomination, all of that stuff plays into it. But within all of that, there are these little eddies, and this is why I want to look at it as threads of meaning, because you can begin to see that we can debrief our wounds. And I know you well enough to, I believe, you are doing that. That's a lot of people just give up religion and God totally and just.
It takes a lot of work to do that.
It does,
and it takes a lot of. It takes courage to step into that and to challenge the things that you were taught that were absolute.
Amen.
And I think it's understanding that those are not absolute.
That's right. And Bob, something that you helped me see is that the best use, the best performance of a belief is to facilitate a meaning, not an end in itself. And Mary Ann, you talked about dogma. A belief that goes no further than itself is dogma. A belief that facilitates meaning allows one to derive something from it that is greater than the belief system itself. And I think that that's important for our spiritual nature because it allows us to reach for the next piece of the mystery that is in front of us. And that's what the journey's about. Now, I'm one in my life. Religion does not have those kind of holds on me. My wounds I have my own wounds, but they're not by religion. They're by institutions for damn sure. But religion wasn't one of them. Even as a Presbyterian, as a child, the things I remember is my 6th grade Sunday school teacher taking us for ice cream if we showed up every week in a month. And, when she went to the Middle East, there was a locust infestation, and people were just picking them out of the air and eating them. I mean, that's the stuff that sticks in a 6th grader's mind. So it was not, I didn't have any of those negative pieces. So I want us to see, and Mary Ann and Bob, both y'all, how do we look at our lives and the belief systems that we have been bred through?
You know what's interesting there, Brett Hawk, is I did not think those were negative things until I started to until my life started to show me that this is not true.
Amen.
And my lived experience. And that's when I started to realize, oh, wait a minute, this is a little messed up.
Well, and it took World War I for many black people who went to France and other places to see what was being discriminated against. They were so indoctrinated to it, it was a way of life. And they became a threat to the very communities that sent them off to war, and they became heroes and some of them were hung when they came back. So that's how do you, again, we're back at, is it grace that causes us to wake, in the ability to finally see? Is it some Gestalt experience that breaks through our void? What is it?
Well, I think it's when we start to question, and you've talked about the parallels between religion and science and so forth, and I think that the thing that's lost in religion is the thing that's most important in science, and that's skepticism. Nothing's ever final in science, and in religion, they look for finalities. They look for an explanation that no one can question. And they've forgotten the essence. If you go back to Moses when he was talking to the burning bush, he wanted to know what was the essence of this God that was talking to him through this burning bush. And the burning bush would not define itself. It said, I am that I am. And that left a big question. well, what are you?
And then we've been filling that in ever since.
And we've been filling it in, but we haven't gone back to the essence of it. We've filled it in with a bunch of old men sitting on a throne on the clouds, and we filled it in with all of these
Bob,
things
that's
that
institution.
are not part of the original.
But are you doing that? Have you filled it in that way? Or are you now demythologizing it and beginning to see in a new way? And see, that's what I think is happening. I think the East and West began to get together at the beginning of the 20th century. And that this dialogue, and this is where we get Campbell's work, this is where we get Jung's work, this is where we get this conglomeration of understanding the deeper meanings that these belief systems, these traditions, were trying to present. And I'm suggesting there's a new way of looking at all that and not getting hung up in it, but seeing the meaning even from when we get hung up in it, so that we can look at it in a deeper reflective way, if you will. Am I making sense?
Well, yeah, you are. But I want to go back to the idea of questioning. From the institution's point of view, they don't want you to question, and that's where dogma comes in, and that's where you're forced into a certain belief system. And for me, I had to move away from the church. Well, I was kind of pushed out of it when I gave a youth sermon when I was 15 years old, and started asking, well, what's going on? What are the questions we should be asking? What's happening in the world around us? This was in the heat of the racial reawakening, the heat of the sexual awakening, all of these questions that we had when we were young people. I looked to the church to help me with that, but instead it threatened them, and people were leaving the congregation because of it, and so forth. So I had to step back, and that's where I moved towards science. But I really believe that the questions that are being asked are the same. If you're only allowed to ask the questions within religion.
And see, I had just the opposite, because the churches where I went with my questions, and they just shepherded me right into divinity school. No questions, no money. I mean, they just said, you need to be thinking about this and asking these questions. And so
which is very
my perspective
it was the same church. It was exactly the same church.
It's exactly the same church.
Oh my gosh, that is so
at a different time. And Bob, that what you're talking about is a place that you can look at this way of thinking about religion differently at your own life, and see that you were caught up in a crossroads. What are the three essential processes in the metaphysic I've laid out? Complexification, differentiation, and semi-permeability. You are at a crossroads of both complexification and differentiation. And people's semi-permeability, there were whole new values coming across that they did not understand, and they were afraid of and fearful. They were scared. And
well, you're talking about asking those questions and being shoved out for that. In my world, if you ask questions, that was because the devil had you, and you were being influenced by the devil, and that shut those questions down almost immediately, because that's where those were coming from, and you had to fight those, and you had to work against those. To work through that is very, very powerful and difficult. And I think something that we haven't really talked about, but with religion versus science, asking those questions, and yes, they can both be avenues for those questions, but I think religion brings in your emotions in a much more impactful way, because you start to talk about an afterlife and the meaning of life and death and what happens afterwards. Where science, we're just trying to figure out, okay, what is life? Where are we going with it? And you're asking those in a very different way, where you can be a little bit less you can be more dispassionate, because when you're talking religion, you're talking your eternal soul, right?
Yeah, but there's just as much dogma in science, and there's just as much institutional inertia in science as there is in religion.
Yeah,
because it's a human creation. Both of those types of institutions are human creations, and people, as you say, are afraid that when they are challenged. That's why it's so difficult to get a paradigm shift within science.
And in the world, it's very difficult, because the fact is, the new is frightening. We haven't yet assimilated or accommodated it. It's coming at us from all directions a lot faster and quicker than change has ever happened before. It's very, very difficult to keep up. I mean, I'll be honest, the last 2 weeks, you know what one of my main studies has been? Semiconductors and the diode. Because LEDs has changed everything. So what is an LED? I've taken apart light bulbs now, and it's like, okay, I understand this, and I wish my brother was alive, because I'd be all over him with questions. So it's the changes are so many, so fast, and that's why I'm recommending a different way to look at religion, as a relinking, and that linkage is it's always going to fall short. It's always going to be human, as you were saying, Bob. But I go back to the source. The whole point of relinking our lives is to link it with what is most true, that we might find greater accord with this great movement that is being, that is life, that is consciousness. It's the universe. It's the oneness. You know, someone asked me if I pray. I go, all the time. They go, who do you pray to? And I go, I pray to the oneness of all being. I think there's this huge network, and I'm in it, and we're talking to each other all the time. Man, I go into the woods or next door into the wetlands. It's talking. It's speaking.
And you're contributing to that, and it's contributing back. And,
I pray
and
so.
You're shaping it.
I pray so. I pray so. And that's it. And religion is a look into the archive of the human soul, that we might see how human beings have put the world together in so many different ways, and in trying to reach for a greater accord. And it took Islam one generation to corrupt itself. It took the Christian church 300 years. The Hebrew church corrupted itself and redeemed itself 3 or 4 times in the Hebrew scriptures, and that's part of the story of what it is. And you can see the same thing in Mahabharata and Vedantic thinking, whether it's Gita or the stories of the way evil dams up the rivers of life to keep them to itself. There's all these different ways of seeing the deeper meanings of who we are as human beings. And I think if we could just get over the belief bull crap, we could see the deeper meanings.
Well, you talk about keyholes. I think that there's keyholes through all of that belief stuff. And for me, being raised as a Christian, one of the most powerful keyholes was a red letter edition of the Bible. Because you could go into the red letter edition and you could see the words that Jesus said, or at least an approximation of them, or written by someone who might have heard them or something like. Anyway, but if you just read those, the questions are a lot easier to answer than all of the stuff around them. And I think that's true of something like the Tao Te Ching. If you go back and read the original, before you read all the comments about it, you get a better keyhole into that meaning. And I think that's what we need to do more of, is go back to the real essence of what started the religion. And that's what we got to focus on. That's what we got to relink to.
By the way, that was why we renamed our church Origin. Go ahead, Marianne.
Well, I was just going to say, and that's where you go back to trusting your own interpretation of life. And when so unfiltered, we're used to being told what to think and what to believe, and that we accept that. But when you take that on your own personal responsibility and you go back to the origin and you go back to the original text, or you go back to just nature, and you walk in the middle of the forest and you trust that your own interpretation of what you're seeing and feeling and hearing is valid. And I think that's something that we have gotten away from.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you can't interact with other people about those things.
No, absolutely.
That's what we're doing here, I think.
Well, and
we're bouncing our reflections off of each other.
And the real question, because I've spent 40 years with my nose buried in ancient texts, is can we go back? Going back is a projection at some level as well. And that doesn't mean archaeology and all these things aren't telling, because my God, they are so telling of who we were and who we are. And that's so important. And that's what I'm trying to get at with this whole way of seeing that from the beginning and the corruption to the way the tradition became a power system, and they all do, the whole thing, it's the same story over and over with different iterations and, different characters, but it's the same story with the same meanings. And again, those meanings have to be love, compassion, joy, forgiveness, hope, empathy. If they're not, the human family will not survive. And that's what's going on right now. And when we look, and this is why Aldous Huxley's work on perennial philosophy is so important, is to see that when each religion is going up a different side of the mountain, so it looks very different. But once you get to the very top, all the religions, they're not the same, but they all fit together so that the fullness of the mountain is revealed. And that's part of what we're trying to look at through these keyholes, that we see that the human family is one, joined together as one. And these deep meanings, they do, if we watch all the rivers of belief flow, they all flow to the same ocean, which is these positive emotions, in my understanding.
Yeah. And, it's interesting, you bring up Huxley. Well, you look at the other side of Huxley in his novel Brave New World. He was looking at the problems that belief structures can impose upon people and can control people with. And so his life was being bounced between these two extremes, just as we've talked about.
It's utopia and dystopia. We're all bouncing between those. And I hate to say it, but we're coming
minute by minute.
Say what?
I said minute by minute, yes.
Yeah. Mary Ann, final comments on the threads of meaning and the keyholes of life?
We had talked about the linkage, the idea that, religion is a link. And I think what the essence that is found in religions and the reason they survive is because they do all link back to a very fundamental truth about what it means to be a human being and our relation with the numinous, or it's a whole system that a few people figured out and tried to teach the masses. And so throughout history, we have these little icons that we can look to, that this person had the truth, let's study them. This person had the truth, let's study them. And then all of these religions, in their studying of them, came up with interpretations and new meanings. But in fact, what I think is happening now is what you were talking about, Red Hawk, when you said that you pray to this oneness, that not only are we one people, not only are we one, we are also responsible for what is being created out in the world. And it is not something that someone else is doing. And when we can relink our own humanity back to the collective, then that's the only way we're going to actually change the world. And we're going to make it be what it is that we all know it can be on some level.
Amen.
So that's mine.
No, thank you. That's amen. Bob, final comments?
Well, I think it's up to the leaders of religion today to take a good hard look at themselves and at what their policies are doing to the world. To be a Christian has changed so much in the last, say, 10 years, 15 years, because of the politicalization of what they term as their religion. And I think that what they have to find is a way to relink to these original meanings. And what other people have to do is look at these signposts, these guidelines that we've talked about week after week, that point us toward love, that point us toward compassion. And if your religious leader is not following those signposts, then you're in the wrong place and you got to find another place. So both the leaders have to take a strong look at themselves and the followers.
Amen. And the whole issue of religion has been so warped, but that's what religion does, especially once it seats itself within an institution, creates its own class. And that's when the beliefs facilitate no longer the meanings, but the institutions and certain classes. And people get us thinking that, hey, that's what it's supposed to be. And we've talked about meaning today, didn't we? So where else do we go? Well, something I've read long ago, that God is not a matter of addition, but a matter of subtraction. One of the Buddhist followers said, Buddha is the hole in the privy, the toilet, if you will. It's the empty place that makes its whole function worthwhile. And yet, it's the empty place. What is this meaninglessness? Matthew Fox talks about spirituality of negativa. That's the zero-ness of things. That's the getting rid of all the beliefs. That's when the meaning falls out and everything becomes meaningless. See, I believe that's when your journey really begins. And maybe that's the peace where we can break free of the gravity of those things that hold us, our wounds, our belief systems that make us angry and continue to fester in our souls, because we all have them. Meaninglessness. Maybe that's the real way out, and not really the nothing that we've been fed. God's peace and the holy oneness of being with you in all ways.